Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Themba Mdletshe, and I'm from the Public-Private Partnership unit within GTAC. Welcome to today's webinar. Today we are dealing with the Gauteng Schools Programme, exploring PPP procurement to construct 54 schools in the Gauteng province. And to do that for us would be our colleague Pontsho Nchodu. Just a brief synopsis on his profile. Pontsho Nchodu is an experienced public-private partnership, infrastructure and project finance professional who has advised on a wide range of projects, including health sector PPP projects, a hydroelectric power scheme, government accommodation and waste management. On these projects, he has participated in various roles as a core team leader, transaction advisor, financial advisor, and financial modeler. Before joining GTAC, his experience involved advising private sector consortia in project finance and deal structuring, provincial governments and municipal entities. He has more than 12 years professional experience in the financial environment, dealing with appraisal, affordability assessments, value for money assessments, and financial modeling of PPPs and large infrastructure projects. His current role at GTAC involves doing initial project screening and appraisal, project ideas for investment decisions, designing a fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, cost-effective procurement process, and providing technical assistance to departments and municipalities. And with that introduction, I'd like to give over to Pontsho to begin with his presentation for today.
Thank you, Mr. Mdletshe, for that introduction. Just to ensure that you are not dealing with a ghost worker, I just switched on my video so that people can see who Pontsho is and if they can compare it with the previous photo to check if there are any changes or scars. I will now share my screen and start my presentation. Okay, let me put it on presentation mode. Mr. Mdletshe, can you see my presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks for that introduction. My presentation is going to be on Gauteng Schools Project. It's a design, finance, construction, maintenance of 54 schools around Gauteng. And in the agenda, I'll be giving you a project description, option analysis, CAPEX, risk, value for money, transaction structure, terms of the arrangement and the development impact, and then the status. So to start with everything, I've put on the PPP project cycle. So the project at the moment, it's at the feasibility study stage. The needs analysis was conducted, the options analysis was done, the project due diligence, the value assessment and the economic valuation was done, and then there was a procurement plan. So the inception part of the project has been done. The project was registered with National Treasury, and then Gauteng Department of Education, in conjunction with GIFA, Gauteng Infrastructure Funding Agency, they appointed a project officer and then also appointed a transaction advisor who assisted in doing this feasibility study. So in terms of the project, the initial problem statement that the department had was that the department, as we speak, has a lot of challenges, and especially in Gauteng, it is evident at the beginning of every year or at the end of every year, after the introduction of this online application for grade 1 students and I think grade 7 students, people are complaining that they don't get space. Some complain that they got spaces and classes are overcrowded. So the problem that the province faces is that firstly, it is due to economic, historical challenges previously. We know that in the past, the historically black townships, their schools, they are in poor conditions, they are overcrowded, and they lack basic facilities like sports fields, laboratories, and stuff. So these conditions are not suitable for delivery of quality education. And the second issue is that the province has a significant influx of new learners. We know Gauteng as it is, once people have matriculated or graduated, they come to Gauteng to look for better opportunities. So there's a whole lot of migration happening in and around Gauteng. There are new townships popping up everywhere. There are new suburban areas which have been developed. So this causes a space deficit. And in terms of the plans, the department wanted to eradicate this by 2030. The province had made several attempts in terms of trying to deal and handle this issue by doing conventional procurement method. But with the pace that we are going in the country, the department they usually open about four or five schools per year. And in terms of the backlog, we can't match that. And then the third problem that we're having is the affordability aspect, because we need to sort out the infrastructure problem, whereby there are certain areas where they don't have schools. There are certain areas where they have lots of schools, but they're not maintained properly. So in terms of the budget allocation, the department is in a catch-22 situation in terms of whether do we focus more on building new schools and then maintaining less. So that was a third problem. And this is evident to everyone who lives around Gauteng, whether it's Pretoria or Johannesburg. We can see that most parents or some parents move their kids from township schools because of the first point, and learners are traveling long hours and distances to get to school. So the challenges was that in some schools, there's overcrowding, and there's overutilization of schools. And then there's poor maintenance, and sometimes when there are natural disasters, learners end up not having schools. And then there's insufficient fund to deliver infrastructure due to lack of delivery capacity. And these conditions led to inadequate provision and maintenance of infrastructure. So in trying to address this, the department had various options, like providing scholar transport and implementing alternative methods of delivery. And this is the point that we'll be dealing with in terms when it comes to the options analysis, because scholar transport and implementing this alternative method, they have their pros and cons, and those are also the matters that needed to be considered. So before everything happened and during the needs analysis stage, the department conducted a survey to determine the backlog, and then they also developed a minimum uniform norms and standards for school infrastructure. Because if you drive around, you'll see that some schools have sports fields and labs, some don't, and in terms of even the size of the classrooms. And then to compound this, in Gauteng, the MEC of Education has a big dream of making our schools to be smart and not to have chalkboards. They prefer that teachers are facing the students when they are teaching them. So based on the survey which was done, there's an existing shortage of 1,652 classes. And then when we now doing the calculations, it equates to a need of 150 new schools that needs to be provided in the province. So that's how big the backlog is. And then in addressing this, the department and GIFA initiated the Gauteng School Programme. And the first issue which they needed to address was to eradicate 22 asbestos schools in the province, because the Minister of Education proclaimed that by 2025, there should be no schools there should be no asbestos schools in the province. And then the other goal was to replace some of the mobile schools with brick and mortar. Because in terms of the way things are done, when there's a new neighborhood or a township, the department will see that there's a need for schools, and then they will put in containers and maybe some mobile schools as a temporary measure. But the country finds itself in a position whereby these temporary measures end up being there for a very long time. So this is one of the things that we wanted to sort out. And the third one was to build additional greenfield schools to deal with the shortage. So the initial package, when the feasibility studies started, it was to have 110 schools. But as we did the needs analysis, we did the budget analysis of the department, we realized that the cost of building one school and maybe making it 210, it was not affordable. And then also, as we went forward during the due diligence phase, we realized that there are some schools which are not on state land. They belong to churches or NGOs. So for us to try to maybe fast track this whole process and evaluating what we have, we ended up with 54 schools. And in terms of our view and aspirations, all schools are required to have facilities like laboratories, kitchens, admin blocks, sports field, and other facilities as captured in the regulation. So in terms of the options that were on the table, the first option was to check if we can build new schools. Basically, it's like what we are, the initial thinking of replacing old schools, building new schools, and then finding new schools that we can construct. The second option was the rental option. That basically meant that the Department of Education would request DID, Department of, let me call it a Gauteng Public Works, to look for land or to look for buildings and apartments which can be converted to schools and also have and also meet the norms and requirements that are set in the policy. Then the third one, I think in some areas it is still ongoing. It is looking for schools which are maybe transporting schools from areas where they don't have schools and then take them to different schools. And then the other option, which was also explored in terms of resolving this, was combining existing schools. This thing is it's also known as platooning. It is mainly known in rural areas, whereby maybe learners from grade 1 to grade 7 will go to school at 7 in the morning and knock off at 11, and then there'll be another group of learners doing grade 8 to 12 going there. But in terms of analyzing these options which are available on the table, we realize that the best option is to build schools where they are needed so that we can avoid buses being broken down, so that we can avoid kids being left by transport and also road accident. And it is also not user-friendly for students to travel for about an hour before they can get to school, because anything can happen. So our best option was to say, let's build new schools, because anyway, there would also be a service delivery protest when people during elections and in other aspects, they will complain and say, we don't have schools. We have our kids need to have to travel for a long time. And in terms of the CAPEX and the budget statement, this slide is going to be it's going to be short and simple, because I didn't want to delve more into the numbers for this project, because the project is still in feasibility and it might go to procurement and the bidders might end up having insight of what is the plan of the state. So it is going to be, this slide is more like a mini skirt. It reveals a lot, but it doesn't show everything. So the total CAPEX for the school infrastructure, whether we are doing it as a PPP or conventional procurement, we will need about 4.7 billion. And that includes the school infrastructure, the buildings, and then FF&E, which is furniture, fittings, and equipment. So in terms of our analysis and in terms of the process, Treasury Regulation 16, it therefore means that the department, if they want to do this project, they would need to have a budget allocation of 4.7 billion and then go to procurement and spend it immediately. But we know very well in terms of the budget that you are having for education, that would mean that there are many other things that the department needs to sort out in terms of maintenance and infrastructure, because there are other existing schools. It would have that crowding out effect. An alternative that the department will have is to maybe explore a PPP option and pay what we call a unitary fee. So basically here in our budget and capital analysis, you are at a point whereby you want to buy a car. It's either you buy it cash or you go and borrow money. So the unitary fee is more like an installment. So if we do it as a PPP concession, the total project length would be 17 years. The first 2 years, it will be the construction of all the 54 schools. And then 15 years, it will be the concession period. So after construction, the private party will do the maintenance and all the bells and whistles. The only focus that the department would have in this project, it will be employing new teachers, working on the curriculum. If there are any curriculum changes, that will be the main focus, and that is the core function of the department. So it would work out better for the department. And then in terms of funding this, the private party will be responsible for funding the schools through a combination of debt and equity. And then the private party will conclude separate financing agreements with lenders. And then the department, being assisted by GTAC, it will take the asset over after the concession period. So in terms of the PPP unit, we have 3 key tests to check if we can proceed with the project. And there's also this section which is called the value for money or value assessment. It is also used to check which procurement method it is. Which procurement method will work for this. So what usually happens when we do our value assessment and value for money assessment? We would take an option whereby the department is doing it through conventional procurement, then we add risk, and then we compare it with a PPP option, and then with risk, and then the one that gives you more value for money would opt for it. So in terms of this project, we did the value for money assessment. The numbers, as they say, they don't lie. They show that the PPP reference model is the most efficient, and it would work for this project. So the department opted for that. There's a mess up a bit. This is going to be was supposed to be my last slide. I will come back and talk to it. Yeah. So in terms of the transaction structure that we have envisaged, we would have a GFA and GDE and also DID, they will have an implementing agent memorandum of understanding, and then GDE will sign a PPP agreement with the private party. The private party will go and borrow money from the lender and have a financing agreement. The expanded version of the previous slide, it is demonstrated in this picture, whereby you will see that there's a couple of agreements that needs to be signed. So the institution will sign a PPP contract with the private party, and then the private party will sign the financing agreement. And in between that discussion, the lenders will also have a direct agreement with the institution. This is more of the protection that the lenders will get in case the private party doesn't pay. And then in the private party is owned to have shareholders who should have a shareholders agreement, and then there'll also be a construction subcontract and operating a subcontract. And then under the PPP agreement, I spoke about the first point. All the technical PPP, all the technical risks under the PPP agreement will be transferred to the private party. And then the private party will be responsible for funding the schools through debt and equity. And then the private party will conclude separate financing agreements with one or two groups of lenders. And then under the PPP agreement, GTAC will take over. So in terms of the planning and the thinking, when we go into procurement, these 54 schools are going to be clustered in maybe 4 or 5 clusters of 12 and 10 schools. That will depend on the geographic position of that, and then will therefore mean that when we go to the market for the 54 schools, there's a potential that you might have 4 private parties or 5 private parties who will take over the design and construction of schools. And that's the reason why our timeframes are going to be 18 to 24 months, depending on the number of schools, because building a school, it's not as complex as designing an office accommodation project, which has different layers and floors, and you have to put in elevators and all of that. And then in terms of the development impact or socio-economic effect of the project, there'll be employment creation, which will contribute to our GDP growth. And then all those dilapidated asbestos buildings, which are hazardous, which are not good for our health, we will deal with that. They will be eradicated, and there will be an 18 billion output to the local economy through direct and indirect investment. And there will be 6 billion added to the economy in a direct and indirect manner. And 54,000 jobs will be created. And then the anticipated total BE spend is estimated at 12.5 billion. And then in terms of the process, the previous slide, I spoke about how value for money is determined. So in terms of the process, we identified possible risks for the project, ranging from construction risk, which have subheadings of availability risk, completion risk, cost overrun, design risk, utilities risk, environmental risk, and macroeconomic and political. But basically what happened, or what we have, is that we develop a risk matrix whereby each risk is identified. Then we quantify the impact or the quantum of the risk on the project. Then we also determine the probability of it happening. So we do that process for all the project, for all the risks which are listed there. And then we also check how best can we transfer the risk to the parties that can address and deal with the actual with the actual risk. And then our risk matrix will have risks which will be purely transferred to the private party, and risks which will be retained by the public sector. And then those are then added on that evaluation of our value for money. Because the value for money, in terms of that diagram, we have the basic cost and then we add the risk to it. Because we don't want to find ourselves just saying the CAPEX cost is 4.7 billion, but then we have project delays, we have cost overruns, and we didn't factor those in. So we factor those things in and then we quantify them. Okay. So in terms of, let me go back then to the slide that I said I will discuss. At the moment, the feasibility study is complete. But then the biggest challenge that we have was that when we initially did this, we assessed the needs and modeled everything against the overall infrastructure budget of the GDA. So it meant it included the equitable share and the education grant. And the project cost was then initially modeled for 15 years. And there was we didn't factor in additional capital grant to reduce the unitary payment. So this is where the project is at the moment, and this is where we are encountering challenges. Because in terms of the process, the Gauteng Provincial Treasury needed to submit an affordability letter. But when they checked the budget, they realized that we included the equitable share and the infrastructure grant, and we will take most of the money, and there won't be money available for maintenance of other schools. So now we are in the process of trying to do some fundraising, because the key considerations when we are doing this, we need to make sure that the budget allocation is sufficient to fund the unitary payment. And then we also need to ensure that the remaining portion of the budget is sufficient to fund maintenance, renovation, rehabilitation of existing schools. And then a portion of the budget must also remain available to deal with ever-increasing demand. And then there's also a significant portion of new infrastructure. So the interventions that we are currently working on, we have submitted an application to the Budget Facility for Infrastructure, the PFI. It is a process which is run by National Treasury. It's a program whereby mainly still deals with infrastructure projects. They assess it and analyze it and check the need, and if they're confident that the project meets all the requirement and check and balances, then they will fund the money of it. They will fund a portion of it. Then in terms of this, what's going to happen, the lump sum which the department is going to provide, it will assist in terms of reducing the unitary payment that needs to be paid by the department, and it will make the project to be more affordable, and it will make that the portion of that EIG to be sufficient to fund the project. And then we are also seeking support from the national department, so that maybe they can try to ring fence the portion of the EIG towards the unitary payment. And we are waiting in education from the DG. He needs to crunch the numbers and tell us how much is available to assist this. And thank you very much. That template.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Pontsho. Once again, good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks, Themba, for holding the fort. I was just struggling to connect. Pontsho has just taken us through the Gauteng Schools project. They are still at a feasibility study stage, not yet has gone to procurement, but let's welcome now the questions from the colleagues. Are there any questions for Mr. Nchodu? Can we give you over to you? There you are. I see Piwe, and I also see Zwane. Piwe, can you shoot?
Gwenin,
Yeah.
before taking questions, there's Kevin Abrams.
Yes.
From GIFA. I don't know if there's anything that he wants to add or. Okay.
Maybe let's do it this way, Pontsho. Let's take the questions, but he will also have an opportunity to add, or maybe to supplement whatever that you would want him. He will have a chance to intervene, but let's just give the hands for now.
Okay.
Piwe, can you go ahead?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues. My question is going to be, I think it's generic. It's with regards to the contracts or agreements that are concluded between the lender and the private party. I'm more interested in the one between the lender and the institution. What I would like to establish is normally what is the content of that, and how is the institution protected? And what does it really mean? Does it mean that the institution will honor that which the private party has failed to honor financially? What normally happens in that space? That is my first question, Chair. Thank you.
Pontsho, I don't know whether maybe you want to take that one, or should we take Pitso's one as well, so that maybe you take both questions. Maybe let's take Pitso as well. I'm sure you may have recorded that question. Pitso, can you shoot, Baba? Oh, Sisi. Oh, Baba. Yeah. Sorry.
Nice one on a Friday. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. I just have quick comments, but firstly, I want to thank Pontsho for the presentation and yourself for affording us this opportunity to also learn around the provincial structure plans. The first comment, I wouldn't say questions, because I think we're just interacting around knowledge sharing. On the land issue, I think on the presentation indicated that some of the schools are sitting on the land that does not belong to the province. By province, I mean GPG, Gauteng Provincial Government. So are there any other parties who are participating? For now, I'm thinking municipalities, because obviously if it's not sitting on the provincial land, probably I would say it's sitting on the municipal land in the main, but in some instances, perhaps it might sit on the national land. So are there other parties who are partaking to make available the land in the form of maybe donation from a municipality to Gauteng Provincial Government in this particular instance, or maybe from the national to the Gauteng Provincial Government? just to deal with the element of the land. Because this is also an issue around property rates. You'll find that sometimes money is there to pay municipalities around the property rates, but you'll find that the queries are sitting on the element of who owns the land. So those issues are, I'm just thinking, are there any other stakeholders who are participating to resolve the issue of land? And attached to that, the Chair, the feasibility study, did it take into account to the spaces within the existing schools? Because when you look at the other schools that were built some years before I was even born, you'll find that you can accommodate the sports field, you can accommodate other things like your lab and so forth. So I'm thinking maybe, because when I look at where I'm coming from, you'll find that the other schools are separated by just a fence. So I'm thinking, if that's the case, have we also look into the existing schools' land area to check if maybe we can be able to accommodate another school and separate that by fence? Just thinking out loud in terms of the trying to deal with the element of the land. And that, I think we were forced into the digitization, of which also affected the education sector, in that when COVID was, when we were, I think, at some level 4-5, the learning was taking course online. So I'm thinking to myself, as we are going forward, are we also looking at, we're not necessarily fixing by going back in terms of how do we accommodate the element of digitization or the element of online schooling in trying to also address at the same time the element of infrastructure constraints or infrastructure shortage. So I'm thinking to myself that the quantification of so much number of schools, did we also take into account in our feasibility study to say, what is it that can be done to accommodate the method of learning to date in terms of digitization? And lastly, Chair, on the finding model, I think he indicated that the element of education infrastructure grant and provincial equitable share, I'm thinking. But in the presentation, he was also talking about the project. I'm not sure, I'm trying to make sense of it by asking. You mentioned the element of debt and equity. So I'm thinking this is a social infrastructure. The element of debt I will understand, but the element of equity on who? Because when I understand the funding model in terms of debt and equity, I understand differently in terms of the private sector arrangement. But because of time, I wouldn't want to get there. So I did not understand. I would understand when I'm talking about the provincial equitable share or the EIG. But the element of debt and equity, I could not understand. Maybe if he comes back, he can also try to clarify, because he just indicated that you'll be funded by debt and equity. But I don't understand, because this is a social infrastructure. How will the shareholder want to regain whatever they've invested through equity? So check, also I'll touch to that. Will there be other cost implication to the citizens of Gauteng via other increases that could be effected through the provincial revenue budget to make money for this particular infrastructure aspiration? So I'm also thinking maybe something that I wanted to gauge with the presenter. And the last one, I think, on legal. Will the contract be able to bind the next administration, that political administration? I noted in the risk there was an element of political risk, but will the legal elements be able to bind? Maybe I'm thinking in this case, the two political administrations, we don't know how will it look like in the next 2014 and going to 2029 and so forth. Will this be able to be continued? Because we've also learned that sometimes with new admins, they also tend to question the decisions that were taken by other administrations. So I'm also thinking in terms of legal, will that also cover to enable this project to continue in the foreseeable future or as planned? Thank you for the opportunity and indulgence, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. That was mouthful. Also, I don't know which question do you want to take, whether you want to take the first one, but I will assist in reminding you on the second one, because there's quite a lot of things that have been raised there by Peter. But can you first maybe decide which one you want to take? Do you want to take the first one by Piwe? She wants to know about the contract between the lender and the institution. She's more interested in terms of what normally is the content of those things? Does that mean that the institution has to honor? What does that mean? Do you want to take that one?
Okay.
Kevin, you are also free to add as well. Okay.
Thanks, Kwanin. On the first one, and I think in answering the first one, I will touch on some of the things that Umanget asked. The first one, in terms of the contract between the institution. So basically, to break it down, there's a PPP agreement. So within the PPP agreement is an agreement between the state and the private party. Then in that PPP agreement, there are different schedules and clauses which deals with how performance of the private party will be dealt with, and what happens if they don't perform, and what penalties are going to be charged. So that will reduce the unitary payment. So now, because this contract is it will be done via a PPP agreement, the lenders will have an agreement with the private party, but then to get some level of comfort, because what's going to happen is that if the private party gets penalties and it gets to a point whereby the penalties and the default are leading to termination, the lenders, based on the agreement that they are having with the state, they will be given an opportunity to step in and try to remedy what's happening initially. So they will come in and talk to the private party and say, guys, we've borrowed you money, and if this contract gets terminated, there's a long calculation which has to be done to determine what needs to be paid to us as the lenders. So that's the first thing. They will get the step-in right. But then the lenders in the direct agreement, it is more of an agreement whereby the lender is informing the state that be aware that the private party that you've appointed has a big brother called a bank who is involved, who's always checking if the private party is meeting its obligations and it doesn't miss any payments and all of that. And in addition to that, please keep us in touch if this younger brother of ours is not actually performing or delivering, so that we can come in and remedy. Because in this process, before we get to the actual termination of the project, the lender, if is not happy or the private party is not changing what needs to be changed, the lender is given an opportunity to go and look for another private party which will be able to deliver this thing efficiently and then do it. And because this thing is mainly a long-term contract, and I think that's why I'm saying some of this answer will also maybe touch on what Peter asked, because this process is governed by Treasury Regulation 60. It therefore means that the province is making a commitment to be into this project for the 15 years. And then they will also need to get Treasury approvals. These Treasury approvals assist the Minister of Finance to be able to have a letter of concurrence. It is more of saying that we are giving this project and process and a guarantee, not an explicit guarantee. People from Treasury, we talk mainly of what we call a contingent liability, which is more like in the budget statement annually, there is a certain number of contingent liability. So basically a contingent liability for people who have done accounting in school is more like your accumulated depreciation or your provision for bad debts. Is basically an amount of money which the state will make a provision in case there's termination. So Regulation 16, once a project is signed, it becomes very difficult for the new administration to come and say this process was not done unduly. People who have done these PPPs, they know that some people had tried to do this, but because the process is governed by Regulation 16, the province is involved, National Treasury is there, then everyone becomes protected. So the PPP agreement has conditions that protect the state, and that also speaks on issues like your termination and default. And then the direct agreement assists in terms of how do we deal with disputes and that. I think.
All right. Thanks, Pontsho. There you are, Pure. The contract deals with the obligations on both sides to protect both the state and the lenders. And because most of these lenders, they take 90%, they are the ones who normally provide 90% when it comes to this project, and 10% is normally comes in the form of equity. So they would always want to make sure that they also have got stepping rights if there's something to be replaced with the private party, or if the contract terminates, that there's no undue enrichment. Kevin, I see your hand. Do you want to add before we go to Zwane's answer? You can go ahead if you want to add on what Pontsho has done with regard to the first question. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks, colleagues. Good afternoon. No, I don't want to add to Pontsho's responses. I'm happy with that. I wanted to come in on responses to some of the other questions.
Okay, with regard to Pitso's questions.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe just a reminder that he said quite a lot. You wanted to know more about the schools, whether some of them are on national land, some of them are on municipal land. So we need to take into account that. So also the other things was regard to the schools. Said there are also lots of spaces in some of the schools, existing schools. Has that been taken into account? The other one was digitization. Has there been a thinking around the online schooling that is taking place? Then the other one was a funding model. You were saying that this is a social infrastructure project. He does not understand the debt and equity part, and also whether maybe there are cost implications. If there are anything else that I'm leaving, I'm sure you will come back again. So can you just then shoot Kevin on some of Mr. Zwane's questions, and thereafter Pontsho can add as well if you so wish. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Chair. I'll start with the land issue. I think the land issue was something that we obviously looked at when we did the due diligence report, and the initial 110 schools, there were some challenges with some of the sites, as Pontsho has indicated. So the reduction had two benefits: the reduction in numbers. First of all, obviously, the affordability challenge was partly then also mitigated in a way. And secondly, the land issue. The 54 schools were eventually the number of schools where all the land issues were finalized and clarified. In other words, it would all government-owned land, where it was not provincially owned. It was nationally owned, where there was a vesting process that was already in process, where we just needed to vest it from RSA to Gauteng provincial government. So the reduction in numbers sorted out all the land issues. So the due diligence was done there. I think a critical question was around the where schools are sharing a fence. And obviously the education department did look at how facilities could be shared with two schools, but most of the cases like that you'll find in the very old townships, like for example in Soweto, where historically you had a Xhosa speaking school and a Tsonga and a Zulu speaking and a Tswana speaking school. And you'll have all these small schools consisting maybe of 12 or 14 classrooms, catering for a specific language of instruction. And it is unfortunate that these schools are now right next to each other. So the department has embarked on an exercise to see if they could merge these schools. The unfortunate part of the issue is when the demand was looked at, the analysis of the demand and the needs. Unfortunately, the demand is in other areas, especially newer townships. And the majority of the schools in this package are in new township, new expansions, and you can only use some of those underutilized schools, if you want, by transporting learners there at enormous costs. So in the costs, in the options analysis, we also looked at the cost of learner transport, and it's exorbitant costs. So it's better to invest in new infrastructure in those areas where the demand is, because learner transport costs, you know, is an ongoing recurrent cost on an annual basis, which is very high. And it also impacts on the delivery of quality teaching and learning, because there's, like Pontsho said, there's a lot of time lost during transport and other transport-related risks. Community involvement in the school, because then it means the parents are living very far from the school and they can't get involved in all sorts of activities that you would require them to get involved with, getting involved with school governance through the school governing body, et cetera, et cetera. So that was also looked at in the options analysis. So unfortunately, that does not really solve much of GDE's problems in terms of that. So the land issue was then resolved.
Okay. All right. But all right, go ahead. Then,
if the other issue was the online schools,
yes.
So GDE is probably leading the country in what we refer to as smart schools, in terms of trying to digitize education by doing away with you know, textbooks in hard copy form, in terms of improving on more smarter ways to deliver education through the use of the latest technology, etc. But I think in terms of online schooling becoming an alternative in the short to medium term, I don't think we're there yet. And we've had extensive discussions with the experts in education, both at provincial and national level, in the sense that there's issues of capacity to do this. Secondly, there's issues of policy. And thirdly, there's issues of quality management, and of course, resources. So I think online teaching or online schools is a solution to be looked at. Maybe it's going to be a long-term solution to move away from physical teaching and learning. But I think it's not a solution that is going to bring any relief to GDE. GDE's admissions crisis that they experience on an annual basis in the short to medium term. Just on the admissions crisis that they experience annually, it's actually a moving target, and the colleagues at GDE, you know, they cannot keep up. The number of schools that they build every year is much lower than the demand for schools on an annual basis. So actually, they're getting more and more behind on an annual basis in terms of the shortage of classrooms, and your learner classroom ratio is actually increasing on an annual basis, where the national norms and standards refers to a maximum of 40:1 in a primary school and 35:1 in a secondary school. And in some schools, we know they're exceeding that. So I think they are looking at online, but I don't think it's a short to medium term solution at this stage. So we still need these schools. Yeah, I think I'll pause at those two unless there's some follow-ups. Thanks, Paula.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I think you have touched on many of the questions. I think the ones that are left from Zwane now is just explain, he believes this is a social infrastructure. What has debt and equity got to do? Just explain a little bit about equity. He said he could understand debt, but what does that equity means and so on. Yeah. And then Pontsho touched also on the contract. I think he asked the question in these contracts, because sometimes next administrations normally question what happened before. Are they binding on the next administration? Touch on that, and therefore maybe link it with the grant, because you talked about the grant. Just maybe talk to the relationship between the debt and equity as well as the grant. I guess you will talk maybe to explain maybe the BFI that we have spoken about. Then the final one was, is there any cost implication? I'm not so sure what the cost implications to the South African BITSO, but it talks also to cost if there are any cost implications. Maybe linked to that, Pontsho and Kevin, there is also another question on the chart that say, what is the envisaged role of the community around maintenance of these schools? That one is coming from law. Okay, can you go ahead, Pontsho? Just take the outstanding ones that I've just mentioned now.
Yeah, in terms of the debt equity, because we'll be appointing a private party using not the conventional method of doing things. It's more like the private party needs to go and borrow money from the lender. So part of the financing agreement between the private party and the private party and the lender is that the lenders would basically give the private party maybe 80 or 90% of the debt. The logic behind that is that the private party, where the lender, is also protecting themselves in this process, because in a case whereby in finance term we use the term called skin in the game. So the lenders believe that the private party needs to have skin in the game, and then they must have some equity, which is at risk. Because if it so happens that there's termination going on, the private party who is involved and doesn't have equity involved won't be having a bigger risk, or won't have a risk in terms of that they can just pack up and leave. But if they have something to lose in the process, then it will also motivate them to deliver on their responsibilities.
Okay. The contract?
The contract, what was the question on contract?
Is it binding on the next administration? Because there's a tendency of new administration questioning the decisions that have been taken before.
Yes, the contract is binding, as I've alluded before, that there'll be a concurrence from National Treasury. So the Minister of Finance will also be part of this project. So when signing the contract, there needs to be I think Section 66 submission to the minister, so that there can be that contingent liability to the state, and also state that this project is ongoing and is binding to the government, irrespective of which administration is involved. And
yeah, okay. I think on the cost implications, either way, indirectly, there might be some cost implications, obviously, for citizens, but children that goes to those schools, I know that there is, for those who are in the sector, they will understand there are no fee-paying schools, and then there are those who are able to pay. Obviously, with the involvement of a project, one way or the other, indirectly, there might be cost implications. Kathleen, I'm in your hands. I don't know what is your timeline. When do you want us to end? You will tell me with regard to this one. Maybe can I just give you a second just to respond on that one? Do we still have time, or can you still take more questions?
Yes, Mr. Ngamlana, we have about 11 minutes to go. So if there are any more questions, we can take them. Okay, there's 11. I think one last question that was Kevin or Pontsho. What is the role of the community, especially around maintenance? Can communities be involved in as far as the maintenance of these schools are? I suspect, I don't know whether maybe it's referring that when these contracts taking place,
do the surrounding communities have a role to play and participate in this project, and specifically to maintenance? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one, Kola.
Shoot, Kevin.
Yeah, at tool, obviously community involvement during construction, that would be regulated by certain requirements within the tender process. So I think that one is covered. I think in terms of the current status quo and the way the South African Schools Act is crafted, communities through their school governing bodies. Remember, school governing bodies are elected by the parent body, which is out of the community. So the school governing bodies have certain powers in terms of the South African Schools Act to take responsibility for certain things at the school. Amongst others is the day-to-day maintenance of the school. So the Department of Education, through a policy framework, has to allocate funds to the school for maintenance. So in the PPP specifically, we're going to have to look at how we adjust that through a interaction with the relevant affected school governing bodies, because ideally we want to pass the maintenance risk over to the private party when we do this PPP, which then means is that for the PPP schools, if this project comes to fruition, in the schools for the concession period of say 15 years, you would then say to the school governing bodies, you don't have to worry about school maintenance because it's included in this contract. But you would still in your contract and in your agreements and some of the schedules in the PPP agreement, still try to craft the role and responsibilities of the school governing body and the relationship that the school governing body will have to have with a private party to make this project a success, because governing bodies have a lot of powers in South Africa. So I think that sort of indicates. And then the other costs, the question around costs, most of the other recurrent costs for the project gets covered by the Gauteng Department of Education, especially when it comes to the delivery of education, the professional side of things, the curriculum delivery, where allocations are made by GDE outside of infrastructure for the employment of teachers, the provision of textbooks, and other requirements, equipment, services like water and electricity, communication, data, and all those kinds of things. So those are additional costs. But in the business case, we've articulated the fact that these costs are in any case covered because there's a per learner allocation formula that is used nationally, that funds be allocated per learner to cover those costs. So fortunately for this project, those costs will be covered. Because they are all no-fee schools. They are in very poor areas, so there's no revenue to be generated from school fees like in independent private schools.
Okay. There you are, colleagues. They are all no-fee schools. I think I'm only left with 4 minutes according to Kaslin's time. I think she gave us 11 minutes, so I can see it's 15:08. Then it's probably 4 minutes. Are there any questions? But also to remind you, we are still at the early stages of the project. It's still feasibility study, and Treasury still has to take a decision as to whether maybe they approve that feasibility study if all goes well with regard to affordability, BFI, which is handled by the Treasury in terms of the contributions and all other things. So are there any other questions for Pontsho and Kevin? Okay. Doesn't look like there are any other questions. Kathleen, is there anything that I may be leaving, maybe as a final say from your side?
Thank you, Mr. Ngamlana. I think from my side, I'd just like to remind everyone that content in terms of these webinars, if you're interested in doing some readings, I suppose after hours, or doing some viewing of previous webinars, you can either access content on our Knowledge Hub or by visiting GTAC's YouTube channel.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for their attendance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I hope, colleagues, it was a learning experience for you, and that's the intention of these webinars. I'm sure you may have learned something, and I do believe in future as we go ahead with this project, we wish success for them. Who knows, maybe one day we are going to tell you that we are at a procurement phase. We are now at a feasibility study for this one, and I'm sure you may have learned something. So if now there are no questions, let me thank you for participating. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, everybody who's made this a success. Now, can I adjourn? Now, if there are no questions, thank you, Pontsho. Thank you, Kevin, as well. Thank you, Kathleen. The meeting, our webinar is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Bye.